Sharon Confessore and Michael Reidy, welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's good to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have both of you here with me today. You're both on the East Coast. I'm coming to you from Utah, and it's a beautiful summer day, and it's a great opportunity for us to get together and to have a nice conversation. Today, we're going to be focusing on anticipating the future of work that relies on interdependence and team-wide accountability for safety standards within organizations. I know that's a bit of a mouthful. We'll dissect that a little bit, but the bottom line is things are changing, things are shifting. Certainly, COVID accelerated us into some of the shifts that were already starting to happen, and they're a reality now, and organizations are going to have to increasingly grapple with this. And there's so many different facets of this shifting nature of work and the future of work, but one of those pieces is safety, workplace safety. And how do we do that? So looking at interdependence and team-wide accountability, I think, is a really great focus, and I'm excited to explore that with you today. As we get started, I wanted to share Michael and Sharon's bio with everybody. Michael Reidy is a senior consultant at Abt Associates and former head of the Dublin Institute of Adult Education, has been training teams in safety culture best practices for more than 3 decades. His expertise has supported companies around the world, including Alkermes, Abt Associates, Baltimore Gas and Electric, Calvert, Cliffs Nuclear, Biogen Idec, Bonds, man, I don't know how to pronounce most of these names, Catholic Healthcare Partners, Curtis Wright Flow Control, Dell, GE Capital, GE Crotonville, and many, many more. There's so many great clients that you've worked with, Michael, and I'm excited to bring your expertise in to this conversation. Sharon Confessore is a health system executive experienced in talent development, training, leadership development, executive coaching, change management, innovation, adoption, organizational culture, and restructuring. She's known for creating people-focused strategies and best practices for implementing corporate-wide learning solutions, which she's applied as the chief learning officer of a regional faith-based health system and as a unit head of a fully integrated national health system. Sharon, great to have you. It's wonderful to have both of you as my guests today. Before we launch on into the conversation, anything else about yourselves, your personal backgrounds that you would like to share with listeners before we get started?
Sure, if I could, the part of this that's most exciting for me is that human resource and human capital leaders are in the most amazing place right now in terms of their work and in terms of the value that we bring to organizations. When I think back on my 20 years of experience, each of the kinds of conditions and situations we are now dealing with all at once, we could seemingly take one at a time. But now what we've got is just so many moving parts. We've got to deal with the changing conditions, the practical, legal, medical, all of those pieces. In the meantime, we also have to figure out what we're going to do around reshaping our workforce and the conditions that we have to sustain and even rebuild the conditions for resilience in our organizations. And finally, the bottom line with this all is our leaders and how are we going to support our leaders as we go forward. And so I'm very excited to be here today, and I'm very excited to be part of this brave new world that is human capital and human resources. Our HR leaders have a huge task in front of them, and I'm proud to be a part of the solution set as we move forward.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's absolutely true. HR has always been a challenging area, and there's so many different facets to it. But the scope, the scale of change over this past 18 months has not been for the faint of heart. And I think moving into the future, it's going to continue to just be a huge challenge and a huge opportunity. Michael, anything you would like to add before we launch on in?
I think my privilege, John, over the past 24 years living in North America, living mostly in Boston, but working mostly in North America, but with a company that has had a global reach, has actually been through organizational development or human resources or human capital innovators. And so what I have really dedicated my life to is shifting the focus from an I, me, mine focus to and how does a leader shift the focus to an us and a we and an ours culture? And so underpinning that, or the blood in the veins of that, it seems to me, is co-creating collaborative cultures. And so at the end of this moment in my life, and at the end of the pandemic, or please at the end of the pandemic, I'm noticing that this cross-cultural, cross-collaborative mentality, ability to leave your fixed opinion and innovate in a creative way, in a collaborative way, is paramount. So I am delighted to be with you in this conversation. I think a vital moment where everyone is reappraising or reassessing, to use a word that the Harvard business people have focused on in a report recently out of the Kennedy School of Government, actually, from 87 countries. This reappraisal is what's going on, it seems to me.
Yeah, thank you, Michael, for that addition. And yeah, I completely agree. I think the nature of what we're dealing with is ever present and challenging, of course. As we look into the collaborative nature that's needed in order to drive innovation within organizations, it's like this challenging thing, because so much, as we look at the shifting nature of work, as we look at shifts in the workplace during COVID, a lot of this has meant more distributed workforce, more virtual workforce, or hybrid workforce. And it's hard enough to have like good collaborative environments and strong positive culture when you're all together. When you're all spread out and you may never even be in the same room with the person, it's still possible, but it's challenging and it's new for a lot of people. And so figuring that out within this kind of current context and moving into the future of work, I think is going to continue to be a challenge in a variety of ways. And of course, as we come back to the topic for today, when we're focusing on accountability and safety within organizations and trying to make sure that people are paying attention to that, it's really important. Now, it's interesting, and perhaps we can start here. Now, if we're working virtually, we're in a virtual distributed team, and we're never together in the same place, perhaps that reduces some of the safety risks that people would have experienced traditionally in a physical office space, but it probably opens up new risks and new challenges that organizations perhaps hadn't really thought much about in the past. I'm curious what you think about that, and what are kind of the scope and scale of the types of safety risks and challenges facing organizations as we move into more like hybrid work and a more consistent virtual kind of workplace for a lot of people?
I think there are a couple of risks and challenges that come up immediately. The first one is that when people are all together in a space, they co-create their reality together. And so the way that they work together and the way that they interact together looks very different than when we're distributed and we come together via the Zoom machine, if you will. And so I think one of the real challenges for organizations going forward is to pay attention to the fact that while everybody has participated in the pandemic, each of us has had our own experience. And part of what needs to happen before an organization can go forward is for the organization to create their collective story about what the experience was. And I think one of the risks is that if we don't, it's going to be much more difficult to do that as long as the employees are distributed. And it's going to require a huge amount of attention and focus to take the time to say, let's talk about what this experience has been, so we create the organizational level story of our last 15 months so that people can begin to sort of put everything in context. I think until we do that, it's going to be very difficult to move on to the future and take everybody with us. Michael?
Yeah, thank you, Michael.
I think it's really interesting the moment we're in. As Sharon has said, we're in a moment where many have experienced total distribution. And depending on where you are in the organization in terms of maybe seniority, maybe the kind of work you do, many people are now in the hybrid. They're going in for 2 days. They're going in for 3 days. So there is, it seems to me, a safety principles almost that we draw on to build a culture of safety. And we actually have quite a resourceful reflection on this from at least 2 industries that I'm very familiar with. One is the healthcare industry, and the other is the nuclear industry, both of whom put and have to put a culture of safety as their first priority. I'm not an expert in the same way that Sharon is the expert, having worked all her life within the healthcare industry, but through my work, I have come to understand that there's a personal safety dimension, there's an emotional safety dimension, and there's a psychological safety dimension. And I think they operate, whether you're in the building, metaphorically, or whether you're distributed. My own personal need to be seen, to be heard, my own personal need to feel that I'm part of the culture of co-creating that Sharon has said so eloquently, that is the task, to at least tell the story, the common story, and then create the future story. So my own sense of where we are at the moment is there is a mental an invitation to be careful about the mental well-being of people. And I think nobody really does that better than I think the 2 industries are referred to, the nuclear industry, paradoxically, and the healthcare industry. So maybe Sharon could say a little bit more about those principles, perhaps.
The 2 principles that come to mind immediately is that we know that in a safety culture, leaders create conditions where people feel comfortable raising issues and offering advice and information. And in a distributed workforce, that's going to become much more difficult, and ways to include people are going to become a lot more important. I've heard from any number of clients that people are zooming out, and so they're not as connected as they might be. So that would be one that I would see is a critical issue. And then the other is that employees have to feel comfortable raising issues and knowing that there's a culture of trust. And to some degree, that comes from daily interactions. And I think the electronic media mitigates some of that to some degree. So extra effort on the part of the leader to create that trusting environment is going to be essential going forward.
Yeah, I completely agree with kind of those buckets that you both have mentioned. Certainly psychological safety and emotional safety is super important for employees. And that can be challenging when you're all together. When you're distributed, you just have to be much more deliberate about it, much more purposeful in the interactions that you create, because they don't happen organically anymore. You just have to make sure, you kind of have to manufacture those opportunities. And then, of course, the physical safety elements. And you both raised really great points in terms of psychological safety, being able to speak up, to speak out when you notice a problem. But then the other piece, that was mentioned also is if we have a hybrid workforce, that raises a challenge in my mind. I haven't done the research on this, but if we have everyone together all the time, and we have workplace safety measures, physical safety types of issues, and people are aware of them, they understand the practices, they understand how to navigate those elements, and if something happens, they know the process to report it, they know how to raise the concern, whatever. But now we're moving into a hybrid model where people aren't around all the time, and perhaps they're out of habit, they're not as familiar, they forget, they don't take it as seriously, whatever. It seems like that could create conditions where physical safety challenges could increase dramatically if not handled very proactively. So, I think on all sides, the emotional, the psychological, the physical, we need to focus on these safety elements. And you both have mentioned repeatedly already how that has to be a team effort. That can't just be me as the leader saying, okay, everybody, get everyone together in a Zoom meeting and say, here's the checklist of like, these are the things you have to do. There's a time and a place for information sharing like that. But for the most part, if you're going to have a good, safe environment in all those different areas that we just discussed, you have to do it in a collaborative manner. You have to create buy-in. You have to get other people committed to it and not just feeling like they're complying with some stupid standard that's just an annoyance and a waste of time. Because guess what? When they feel that way, they're going to take shortcuts. They're going to ignore it, and bad things will happen, and people will get hurt in various ways.
I totally agree. I think there is a moment here of co-creating the working environment anew, and it's territory that we've that's somewhat absolutely new to us, given of our countries throughout the globe. One of the big notions, I would say, to build on what you said, John, is creating the conditions for decision-making to be shared or to be distributed. And Sharon has spoken about co-creating the conditions for a number of things, but I would add co-creating the conditions whereby people feel that they can own their part and clear on their invitation to be part of the decision-making process. The leader is not usually best equipped to be the only leader, the only person making decisions, given different levels of expertise, given different environments, different knowledge even. It seems fair to me to say we need a collaborative way of making decisions. And then we need clarity on levels of involvement. I use a phrase sometimes that says that very few parents call their own child ugly, as applied to decision making. If you can create the culture where people make their own, they know they've made the decision with others, they have a different ownership of it. And that applies to the environment. I think it implies to the actual work we're doing. It involves, of course, the safety. What are the decisions we're going to make about keeping ourselves safe, whether we're in work in person or whether we're in work digitally or from a distance.
Yeah, excellent. Sharon, anything you'd like to add to that?
A couple things. One is that to validate sort of our collective thinking about this, McKinsey recently released a piece on the organizations that have made big strides during the pandemic. And they talk about what the conditions were in place for these organizations. And first and foremost was pushing down decision-making responsibility. And interestingly, focusing on team building activities and team effectiveness activities is part of that. And what they found was those organizations that went back to how is our team working together, leaders focusing on very clear goals and strategy, and then leaving the decision-making to the people closest to the action or the outcome, were way ahead of their colleagues who failed to do that. So the collaborative decision-making is clearly an important piece of that work. I would say another critical piece to that work is around building a listening culture. So we talk about, in a safety culture, leaders listen and they do walkarounds. But to be truly effective, listening also involves asking very good questions. And we talk a lot about the difference between advocacy and inquiry. Inquiry is when you ask a neutral question with an eye towards hearing what everyone has to say, as opposed to advocacy, which of course is where you lead with your opinion and then open up the conversation, which, as we all know, is not the most effective way to get the best and the most open feedback. I think one of the challenges going forward short term in particular, but even long term, as leaders are pushed to manage multiple new conditions and situations that they're in for the first time, that the tendency will be to lean toward advocacy versus inquiry. And it's an opportune moment to emphasize the inquiry. Even as a leader, you just want decisions made so you can move forward. So there's going to be a very interesting opportunity, I think, for human resource leaders, business partners, to emphasize this need to inquire and balance the advocacy as they're coaching their leaders going forward.
Yeah, I think that's great. And this really raises, part of the initial point of this conversation, I think, which is that shared accountability for this kind of safety culture, the safety environment. And so everything that you're both saying is absolutely a key pillars of creating that shared accountability structure. And I think, when we empower people to make decisions, when we listen to the feedback that they have, when we give them ownership over the implementation and such, when they feel buy-in to that, another, extension of that is now there's going to be greater levels of shared accountability, mutual accountability, and trust between parties. Whereas if you don't do it that way, and the McKinsey report that you refer to is a great example, highlighting examples of where it's working really well and where companies are lagging. When you don't do it that way, it's the classic kind of compliance versus commitment culture within organizations. We see it all the time and manifesting in a lot of different ways. Safety is just one more example. When you have top-down edicts to your people, it's fear-based largely, even if that's not your intention as a leader. It's perceived as fear-based, like punitive. If you don't do this, you're in trouble. And that can drive compliance with the rule, the policy, whatever. But if you want commitment from people, you want buy-in, you want engagement, you want them to proactively try to do those things, the commitment, which is long-term and sustainable, that only comes through the empowerment approach, the empowerment culture that we've been talking about. And then they hold each other mutually accountable because they were all part of the process of coming up with those standards and understanding what their responsibilities were.
Yes,
I agree. I will add, however, that there is a learning process involved in being able for that to occur. And we tend to think of the leader as the one who needs to empower people to do that, and that's absolutely true. So a critical function of a learning unit in an organization, or the HR team in the organization, is to help the leader become more capable in doing those things. But the other piece of it is that the people who are part of the team need to be ready to take on that responsibility. Because, as we started the conversation, with decision-making authority comes decision-making responsibility. And so there's a whole learning process that needs to happen here in the building of mutual trust that needs to occur. So as the leader says, I'm going to involve you in the process of decision-making, let's say, you've got to work the team through a process to understand and build up to conditions that make it work. So when Michael talks about this idea of levels of decision making, there are tools that we can use that say, let's start off, let's talk about decisions, let's talk about levels of decision making. How willing am I, a leader, to give up this big or this amount of authority, or can I work into it step by step? And when is my team ready to take on the big decisions? Because to go from 0 to 60 in 2 decisions, will be a very interesting outcome as they go forward. And again, I think this is a real opportunity for HR and HCI leaders to understand how you can develop this capability in an organization, because in fact, it can be taught.
To build a little on it, I think I love the emphasis on accountability and shared accountability, as you said, John. And it seems to me that the leader has the task. I first heard this when I came to this country from Ireland in 1995. I first worked at a company called GE Capital, and their big leader was called Jack Welch. And one of his big phrases was, I've heard him say it many times to large groups of leaders, your job is to move your people from compliance to commitment. I'm sure it wasn't his own phrase, but I heard him say it. And I thought, this is a leader, that's the leader's vocation, is to move your people from compliance to commitment. And that means shared responsibility for success and shared responsibility for failure. And I actually prefer it to accountability, because accountability has a little bit of, I hold you accountable my head or in my mind. And somebody famous said there's one finger pointing at you, but there's three fingers pointing back at myself when I make this gesture. So that shared responsibility for success seems to me what Sharon is really talking about. Shared responsibility for decision-making, shared responsibility for co-creating the vision, shared responsibility for safety. Now, shared responsibility is, it's almost an invitation to be an adult at work.
You know what? It's so funny that you say that, because it's very often that I find myself kind of just talking to myself saying, oh my goodness, like when some drama emerges in an organization, or I'm working with somebody and it's more complicated than it needs to be. I'm just thinking, why can't everyone just act like a mature adult? But the reality is, people are messy and organizations are messy. And so, things don't always work out as cleanly or smoothly as you would hope. Well, both of what you say, I think, is absolutely right. And Sharon, your point about not going from 0 to 60 is well taken. Absolutely. Like if we don't already have a culture where we can share in the development process, the decision-making process, it's going to take you time to get there. Whether we're talking about safety or strategic planning or anything, right? It's going to take time to get there. So we want to make sure that we scaffold the experience for our people so that they can have success. Ultimately, driving success is what we're going for. Well, Sharon and Michael, it has been a real pleasure. I note the time, it has flown by. I know you're busy. You probably have other things you need to get onto, but before we close, I just wanted to give you a chance to share with listeners how they can get connected with you, find out more about your work, and then give us the final word on the topic for today.
Sure. I can be reached at capital C, Suite, SUITE 3.com. And that's Sharon Confessore at csuite3.com. My last name is spelled CON, F as in Frank, ESS as in Sam, ORE. And I think my last thought for the day would be, it is the best of times and it is the worst of times. I think that we will not only survive this period, but we will thrive. And as a person who's made her vocation to be in learning, the opportunities for learning are immense, and I look forward to supporting organizations and HR professionals as they continue to learn and accelerate the learning in their companies.
Wonderful, thank you. And Michael?
Michael Reidy, reachable at Reidy, R-E-I-D-Y, at, someone thought this was a great idea, interactionassociates.com. It's a long one, but it's the name of the organization that I joined in 1997 and have remained with. And my final word with, happily remained with, committedly remained with, and find it The philosophy of leadership that I would want to leave with you is a philosophy that says leaders have the ability to make it easier for people to be part of their own work environment. Leaders have the ability to make it easier for people to make decisions and be clear on their level of involvement. Leaders have the ability to co-create the environment where they make it easier for people to solve problems, to share their worries and to share their anxieties. And I call that leadership facilitative leadership. And I facilitate from the Latin facilitare, meaning to make easy. And so I want to leave you with, there's a way of being that a leader can embrace. And I would call it, be a facilitative leader.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Sharon. It has been a real pleasure being with both of you today. I encourage listeners to reach out, to get connected, find out more about what Sharon and Michael can do for you. And as always, I hope everyone can stay healthy and safe, that you can find meaning and purpose at work each and every day. And I hope you all have a great week.